Hello everyone. I'm finding these days I have less time to record, so I have to sneak in bits and pieces of it where I can. I've pretty much finished my tour of Roman literature. I did most of what I set out to do. My original goal was to start to read these 6 volumes I got from a library, each one a biography of a different Roman author or author during the Roman Empire, and then to accompany them with these mass market paperbacks that I've slowly been collecting, and then I can get rid of those, either resell them or donate them as a bunch. And then to top it all off, to read Virgil. This little Oxford hardcover is Virgil's Eclogues, Georgics, and the Aeneid, all in this nice little volume. I did a lot of other things on the way. I read a biography of Mark Antony. I read a book that was on religions, various religions in the Roman Empire. I read most of Edith Hamilton's The Roman Way. Oh, and then bits and pieces from anthologies I have. Just little bits of like Horace's poetry. I did not read all the poems of Virgil. The Aeneid was honestly kind of difficult for me to get through, and so after that I really needed a break. I think there's a couple different factors at play there. One was that I had my in-laws over, and like the TV never went off, which is not an ideal reading environment. In addition to that, I felt kind of alienated from my artistic practices, my other hobbies, my creative hobbies, while I was reading it. I didn't have any project going on, and that always makes it harder for me to read things, because I'm questioning whether I'm spending my time right. But I also don't want to say that Virgil has no part in it. The Aeneid seems to me to be the least focused of the great epics. It definitely doesn't do what Homer does, with the polished, brilliant intensity of the Iliad, or even in the Odyssey, where he deals with a non-linear narrative and multiple characters. It feels like it creates something that's more cohesive than Virgil's epic. I'll definitely be reading the Aeneid again, maybe try a different translation, or even just a different reading environment. But all that to say, it wasn't the peak of my study of Roman literature, which I very much thought it was going to be. The highest point for me was actually one of the first poetic works that I picked up, which is Lucretius's The Nature of Things. Hi again, sorry for the time jump. I was talking last about Virgil and Lucretius, and why this time around reading Roman literature I found Virgil less compelling. And what's interesting about that is how I got to Roman literature, right? I read the works of William Blake, so I wanted to read John Milton. I read Paradise Lost, so I wanted to read Virgil, right? A lot of what is great in Paradise Lost is building on groundwork that was laid by Virgil. But along the way, I found Lucretius, and one of the major things I disliked about Paradise Lost, I think is done better in Lucretius. And that has to do with Milton's didacticism. For all of his poetic prowess, I don't think Milton makes his god sublime. His god becomes a figure to just spout his theology, and every time he speaks, he ends up explaining and defending himself, apologizing for himself, if you will, in a way that does not feel like the grandness of the God of the Old Testament. And I think that's something that is handled better by Lucretius, if not perfectly. At least he gets a lot closer, and it's a difficult thing to do. And I think Lucretius's job is maybe even more difficult, because his God is not the Yahweh of the Old Testament. His God is the Adam. To back up and give you some context, Lucretius is an Epicurean. He is writing his poem because he wants to free men from certain things that he thinks are restricting them and keeping them from achieving happiness. Those include things like the fear of gods, and the fear of the underworld and death, as well as belief in fate, and the accumulation of wealth and riches for oneself beyond what one needs to be happy. And to accomplish some of these things, he goes back to older Greek theories about the atom, his goal being to describe the universe through its most basic part in a way that explains how it can be self-sustaining and self-sufficient on its own without the influence of the gods needed to sustain or upkeep it. Opinions vary a little on Lucretius. Samuel Taylor Coleridge said of him that what is philosophical in his work is not poetic, and what is poetic is not philosophical. I certainly don't think that's completely true. I think it is sometimes true on a line-by-line or passage-by-passage basis. Lucretius can get bogged down in his explanation of his theories, and he certainly doesn't have a poetic intensity throughout the whole. We were just comparing him with Milton, and that's an area where Paradise Lost is vastly better than this poem. Milton never loses his intensity, even in the passages of his poem that I don't like. So in that regard, you can take Lucretius's philosophy, and you can take his poetry, and you can kind of separate them out from each other. You can imagine his poetry, and you can take poetic passages that are not philosophical, and you can absolutely build his poetic system outside of the structure of his poem. But what you can't do is you can't take either of those things away from this work itself. The poem that he has made of his topic takes both its poetry and its philosophy as integral pieces of itself. His vision for the whole, the topics he has chosen, the way he introduces them, the way he argues about them, and the way he advises people to live because of them are not separable from his philosophy or his poetry. As a whole work, as a vision for a whole work, they are integrally knitted. And in that he accomplishes something that seems to be pretty unique and rare in the history of poetry. One more note, though, regarding Coleridge's criticism. I think it's also absolutely true that there are passages in Lucretius that exhibit a simultaneity of his philosophy and his poetry, that exhibit both coming together in really elegant and interesting ways. There's an interesting passage where he talks about whether the parts of the body were created for their use, or whether the use developed from their creation. And I'll read this passage to you. Another fallacy comes creeping in, whose errors you should be meticulous in trying to avoid. Don't think our eyes, our bright and shining eyes, were made for us to look ahead with. Don't suppose our thigh bones fitted our shin bones, and our shins our ankles, so that we might take steps. Don't think that arms dangled from shoulders, and branched out in hands with fingers at their ends, both left and right, for us to do whatever need required for our survival. All such arguments, all such interpretation is perverse, fallacious, puts the carts before the horse. No bodily thing was born for us to use. Nature had no such aim, but what was born creates the use. There could be no such thing as sight before the eyes were formed, no speech before the tongue was made, but tongues began long before speech was uttered, and the ears were fashioned long before a sound was heard. And all the organs, I feel sure, were there before they developed their use. They could not evolve for the sake of use, be so designed. Hi again. A brief aside from my account of the Romans I've been reading. Yesterday I did something I haven't been able to do in a while, which is finish a book within 24 hours. I've been working up to it for a bit. I've been hoping for a one-day book, and I feel like 24 hours is kind of cheating. I read most of it the afternoon of one day and then finished it morning the next, but still an accomplishment. It was this book, 20 Years on the Pacific Slope, which is a collection of the letters of Henry Eno, who was a lawyer who came out to California during the gold rush. And he's an interesting figure because he was well-written and well-educated, but he still had this attitude about him of always seeking something that was going to make him rich, something that would make him rich easily and quickly. And so he jumped around from city to city, depending on where he thought was going to be the next big discovery of gold or silver or copper, and he never found it. And at the end of his life, as his health started to catch up with him, he had to travel back to his brother in New York without a penny to his name. But his account of his life and his stories and his attitude towards the gold rush, what he was trying to do, was all quite interesting to read. This was kind of a good book to do that with. It's outside of my current reading path, so I didn't feel the need to take it very seriously, to take notes or like write down my thoughts about it cohesively. It's also a collection of letters, which is relatively easy reading. And I picked this book in particular because I don't know if I would have ever gotten to it if I didn't read it immediately. I was at a thrift store and this was the only book they had that interested me. So I bought it, kind of on a whim because I didn't want to leave empty-handed, but I know if I didn't read this immediately, it would just sit on my shelf for like a year because of how little it fits in with what else I've been reading. I'm hoping soon that I will actually be able to read a book in a day, or better yet, in a sitting or two. I used to be able to do it when I was a kid. I remember that. And I know those were easier books that I was reading, but my comprehension has also gotten better, so I feel like I should be able to do it. It's something I've been working up to for a little while. I've done a lot of 2-day books, or like 48-hour books. Most of these I read in about 48 hours. And there's another book that I don't have on hand that I did in kind of like 2 evenings. But anyways, back to the Romans. The last one that I want to talk about, because it was an interesting experience, was Horace. And I say interesting, I could easily say frustrating. Not that it's Horace's fault at all. What's actually frustrating is how much you feel that Horace is a good poet, but that you can't access that through translation. And I say that because I read 2 different accounts about Horace. I read this book, Horace and His Influence by Grant Showerman, and then the couple chapters in The Roman Way by Edith Hamilton on Horace. And in all my secondary reading about the Roman authors, those were the standouts. This book was by far the best of the 6 I picked up, and it wasn't even close. It was miles of difference. And then I think personally that the best chapter of Edith Hamilton's book is the chapter on Horace. Something about him encourages authors to step up their game. It's like they feel the need or the pressure to be up to the task of writing about him, to really encourage you to want to read him, even to like him as a person to some degree. The problem is that almost none of the translations I read were any good. I didn't have a book dedicated to the poetry of Horace, which, I mean, maybe that's part of the problem. But what I did was I read the selections of Horace in this anthology and another anthology I have from at least a dozen different translators. There was maybe one poem of all of them that struck me as something worthwhile. There was even one of Horace's odes that I think I read in 4 different translations, because this book had 2 of them, side by side for comparison, and then each of the anthologies I read also had different translations of that ode. And in none of the 4 did I feel like I was reading a great poet of antiquity. There was a single translation I liked in this volume by Louis MacNeice. I'll read that one for you. Winter to spring. The west wind melts the frozen rancor. The windlass drags to sea the thirsty hull. Buyer is no longer welcome to beast or fire to plowman. The field removes the frost cap from his skull. Venus of Cythera leads the dances under the hanging moon, and the linked line of nymphs and graces beats the ground with measured feet while the busy fire god stokes his red-hot mills in volcanic places. Now is the time to twine the spruce and shining head with myrtle, now with flowers escaped the earthly fetter, and sacrifice to the woodland god in shady copses, a lamb or a kid, whichever he likes better. Equally heavy is the heel of white-faced death on the pauper's shack and the tower of kings, and oh my dear, the little sum of life forbids the raveling of lengthy hopes, night and the fabled dead are near. And the narrow house of nothing, past whose lintel, you will meet no wine like this, no boy to admire, like Lycidas, who today makes all young men a furnace, and whom tomorrow girls will find a fire. I found portions of that poem stunningly beautiful. The only problem is I don't know how much of it is MacNeice, who's an accomplished poet in his own right, or the original of Horace. And I never will know unless I pick up some Latin to read the original. There's a reason why Horace is so hard to translate, and that is tackled by Edith Hamilton in what I think was maybe the most insightful page in this book. She compares Horace to Shakespeare, specifically in the quality of being able to choose seemingly irreplaceable words to elevate a sentence beyond what it should be able to do if you were to just look at its meaning at face value. The line she chooses from Shakespeare is from the end of Hamlet, where Hamlet tells Horatio, "Absent thee from felicity a while," telling him that he should not follow him immediately to the grave. And Hamilton's point is that you could take that line, "absent thee from felicity a while," and if you try to replace any word or rearrange the words, it loses poetic power. The exact choice of words and their exact arrangement somehow creates a power that transcends the meaning of that line in the context of the play to make something extraordinary. And this is an experience I've had reading Shakespeare. Actually, the last time I picked up Hamlet... Well, do you ever have to just put a book down when it's too good, when a line just shocks you with its power? That happens to me the last time I read Hamlet. In the very beginning, actually, not the very end. It's when one of the guards, who you never see again past the first scene, tells another guard, "You come most carefully upon your hour." And I was taken aback by how such an inconsequential line in the play could be put so elegantly. Anyways, all that to say, that's what Hamilton says is the essence of Horace's poetry. It is all about that exactitude of choice with regards to his wording. And with Shakespeare, you can translate some of the language away. You can translate it into a different language, and a lot of the characters will still have a resonance that you can attach to. But with Horace's poetry, that's just not the case. There's nothing but the words. Which means if I ever really wanted to understand him as a poet, I would have to learn Latin. We'll see if I get there. But at least for the time being, it made me think about how I write in my own language. I figured I should end this video by talking about what I'm going to be reading next. I finished a relatively large reading project for me, reading over a dozen volumes on a single subject, Roman literature. And at the end of that, when I needed a break, my immediate instinct was to kind of turn back to my poetic roots. It's been about a year since I was getting deeper and deeper into poetry, and I was reading the works of William Blake. And so I returned there. This is the first book I picked up when I was done with Virgil, maybe even before that. And it was good. I read the Poetical Sketches, Blake's first published work, multiple times. I was actually able to get into the headspace to edit a poem that I wrote about a year ago when I was reading some of the same material. But once I was done with that, I didn't necessarily feel inclined to continue. I'm sure I could push forward and move into Blake's other works, but if I don't do that, I may be wandering for a little while I try to figure out what it is I want to read next. For the time being, I'm reading the Odyssey again, for obvious reasons. I have not seen the Nolan film yet. I don't know when I will. But I figured at least I should read the book. It's been probably about a year also. I wanted to refresh my memory about the Odyssey in case I have to have any conversations with anyone about the movie. And also because I wanted to return to the Richmond Lattimore translations that I read a year ago and see if I'm still inclined towards those, if the poetry still holds up for me. And for the most part, I can say yes. There are a couple lines every once in a while that are a little awkward, but overall there's a sense of dignity throughout his translation that I find really appeals to me. That said, if I go and read the Iliad, I might do it in a different translation, probably something older. My next video probably is going to be on the Odyssey. Even though I haven't seen the movie, a lot of people are going to the Odyssey now for the first time, or maybe the first time in a long time. And I think those of us who love the poem have a unique opportunity to talk about our readings, our interpretations, what it is about the work we find compelling, to give people some context as they may be grappling with an ancient and fascinating work for the first time in a while. After that, I'm not sure. I have some ideas. I always have kind of a nagging urge to improve my understanding of English poetry, whether that's reading through an anthology of its greatest users, or taking one of its most significant figures and doing a deep dive into their work. I have a volume of the complete works of Chaucer, and I've been giving that some thought, as well as a couple different anthologies that take different approaches to telling the story of English poetry. Well, we'll see what I end up doing. That's all for now. See you next time.